Okay, welcome back. This is the midterm review. The whole point of this video is to help you study. I have a list of topics, but before we get into that, we kind of need to talk about the rules. So, here we go. This is the midterm exam. It covers chapters 1 through 6. It's open book, open notes, open internet, open everything. There's 50 questions in a pool. Now you don't get 50 questions, you only get 40 out of the pool. So this list has 50 in it, but you're not going to get 50, you're only going to get 40. And in addition to that, there's 2 extra credit questions that everyone gets. Okay, the system randomly picks I don't have any control over what questions you get or what order they appear in. So it's a little weird. So I threw in the chapter and the page numbers primarily to help you study. So that doesn't mean necessarily that, active worksheet is, the question or the answer is going to come from page 49. That doesn't mean that. It just means that's the topic page that discusses those things. If it says no in the column for in the book, that basically means that either it wasn't covered at all, not likely, or it wasn't covered in sufficient detail. And so that's just kind of a note saying, so you might ask yourself, if I say it's not in the book, but it's found on page 55, you'd go, say that again? I mean, if it's not in the book, it's not going to have a page number. So in that case, these are things that are just the closest thing I could come up with. I picked a page number that somehow made a little bit of sense to give you some context. But clearly, if it ain't in the book, it ain't going to have a page number. Okay. You have an hour and 15 minutes to do the work. Now, if you whip out your calculator and you go, that's 75 minutes divided by 42 questions, 40 plus 2 extra credit. That's 1 minute and 47 seconds per question. Whew, that is quick. You're going to have to know the material. There's not going to be enough time for you to stop and go look it up. You just flat don't have that kind of time. So I'm just going to go through the list here. And we'll discuss what I mean by these things, so you won't have any surprises come test day. Okay, the first one talks about terminology, and this is going to be kind of simple. It's going to talk about, workbook and worksheet and cell, those kind of simple concepts. I don't think anyone will have trouble with this. The next one talks about the active worksheet. How can you tell if which worksheet is active, or how can you tell what cell is active? Those kinds of things. The next one talks about commenting. When you add a comment to a cell in a workbook, worksheet, how do you do it? What's the procedures for doing that, or editing one, or viewing one, or deleting one? The next one talks about entering data rather. So I'm entering data into an Excel spreadsheet, and sometimes it's going to automatically format these things for me. Sometimes it's not. And so I give you some examples and say, is this going to be automatically formatted? Yes or no? So you just go down the list. Yes, yes, no, 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 yes, yes. The next one talks about default alignment. And now here's a classic example. This is a chapter 1 question. Okay, now later on in some other chapter, we introduce the Boolean data type, which is centered. Okay, automatically centered. Well, that ain't in chapter 1. So chapter 1 question is going to be whether or not stuff is left justified or right justified. There won't be anything in there referencing some things in some other chapter. So that's why the chapter number provides a little bit of context to these questions. Text wrapping. You know how that is. If you have too much text in a cell, how do you control the wrapping, and how do you make it go higher, and what happens if there's stuff in the cell next to it or not, that kind of stuff. The next one talks about copying and pasting. Most likely you've done a lot of copy and pasting either from the copy and paste toolbar or for Control C, Control V, and you may have noticed there's a pattern on the source and the destination, how that kind of looks when you're doing a copy and paste. The next one talks about the clearing of data from a cell or a range of cells. When you go and clear stuff, what is it clear, what is it not clear. The next one talks about formatting numbers, and so we talked about the general format and the number format and the accounting format and the date format and the currency format, all those things. So I'm going to give you an example of one and say, okay, here it is. Now you tell me what format produced that. Cool. Okay. The next one talks about date formats. We did an awful lot of date formats, for example, in some of the homework we did. And so I'm going to ask you some questions about, how do you go about getting, that leading zero part of the date that I kind of like. Okay. The next one talks about background colors. Remember we talked about, if I went in there and, made the background of my cells, yellow, lassoed a bunch of cells and made them yellow, what's going to happen? What's it going to look like? The next one talks about cell borders and, how to turn cell borders on, how to turn them off, whether or not, things are inherited, those kinds of issues, talking about cell borders. The format painter question is more like, what's the procedure? How do I paint? I love that term. How do I paint a format? Now, do you select the format painter first, or do you select the source first, or the destination first? What's the order and the steps to do those kinds of things? The next one talks, now we get into some good stuff. And now we're talking about the sum function. And so, I'm going to give you some examples and say, which of the following are going to give me the correct answer. Okay, cool. The next one talks about filtering. And once again, this is a chapter 2 filtering. So we're not talking about that goofy advanced filtering stuff or some data table filtering. No, we're talking about just plain old, everyday, turning the little filter checkbox on in the ribbon across the top, and presso changeo, now you can go do some filtering. So I'm going to ask you some questions about row visibility and filtering and that kind of stuff. The next one talks about operational precedence. You guys remember, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, exponents and parentheses, multiplication and division, addition and subtraction, the order of math operators. Okay, cool. Cell references. Now, once again, you have to understand the context for this question. In chapter 3, we were really only talking about, just a few things. We're talking about, relative addressing and, these absolute or mixed. We weren't talking about, any of that structured stuff that comes later on. So when you see these things, that's why the chapter number is kind of important. So I'm going to ask you some questions about, can you tell me which one is an absolute or which one is a mixed, and which one is a relative, that kind of stuff. The autofill is going to be one of those short answer kind of things. Explain to me how autofill is actually going to work under a given scenario, as an example. Okay, the next one talks about named ranges. So just kind of explaining how that works, or when you should use it, or perhaps when you should not use it. What's a scenario-based question? What scenario would be best, or perhaps what scenario would be worst for using name ranges? And then we have the naming convention for named range. Boy, that's a mouthful. And you guys remember how that is, it can't start with a number. It, blah, 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 blah. Same old, same old. The next one talks about functions, and so the functions is just a list of things, and we're talking about general things like, all functions start with an equal sign, and then they have parentheses, and then they have, optional number, could have none or 1 or 2 or 5, arguments, and then the closing parentheses, just the mechanics of what a function actually looks like. The next one talks about lookup, and so going to be asking you about, what are the requirements for getting a lookup thing to work, the VLOOKUP or HLOOKUP. The next one is an if statement. And so I'm going to give you like a scenario and say, which one of these is actually going to give me what I want? And it'll be scenario based. I'll give you a little picture or something and say, which one of those produces the correct answer. Function arguments, again, I've kind of talked about that before, about if I'm entering numbers inside the parentheses of a function, okay, there's some extra rules that you have to apply that don't apply if you're just entering those numbers natively into a cell. Okay, so if you remember what those are, you're good to go. The next one just talks about creating charts. In general, how do you go about selecting the data, and what do you include, and what do you not, and that kind of simple stuff. The next one is specifically about the area chart, and I kind of give a description and, what does it look like, or what's it for, or what's an example, or something like that. Chart type, this is going to be similar to a question we had before about, which scenario would be best for each particular chart type. And to tell you the truth, I'm more interested in that than the mechanics of doing a chart, because practically anybody can mechanically make a chart. So what I want you to know is, what chart should I make? So this is kind of an important question. A combination chart, what are the rules or limitations, for example, on doing a combination chart? The next one talks about modifying a chart. So I already have a chart, it's already put together, and then I want to go back and add a row or add a column that wasn't already in my data. How do I go about doing that? Let me scroll this up a smidgen. Okay. The next one talks about trend lines. Remember how we talked about in the scatter plot, particularly in the scatter plot, you could throw a trend line in, and I want to know if you understand what the significance of that trend line is. The next one talks about adding emphasis. You remember how we had a discussion about, if it was a line chart, you could do this, or if it was a bar chart, you could do this, or if it was a pie chart, you could do that. What are some common things you can do to add emphasis to a particular element in a chart? Not all of them, but you have 5 lines in a chart, and you want to draw attention to one of them. What do you do? The next one talks about data bars. And you remember how we talked about data bars are the ones that actually fit inside the cell? So it's not really a chart per se. And so I'm going to ask you some questions about some similarities between data bars and some other things. The next one talks about a nested if statement. And yeah, I'm going to ask you to write me a nested if statement. Yeah, I know. I'm going to give you a scenario and say, write me an if statement for cell, Q99 that does this, 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 and this. And so you're just going to have to fill in the blank on making me a nested if statement. Conjunctions. Remember how we did logical conjunctions? And then if you have a range of values, so for example, I want, between 25 and 80 inclusive. What do you do to do that? How do I do that? Or the opposite, less than 20 and greater than 80 or whatever I said. So either inside the range or outside the range. How do you go about producing, an and or an or, and what the numbers are to make that actually happen. The next one is kind of a favorite of mine because this tells me whether or not you actually understand. And that is the thing on logical opposites. So I'm going to give you a conjunction statement and tell you, give me the opposite of it. Okay, cool. The next one talks about conjunctions. I'm going to ask you some very simple questions about, what do they look like, or how many of them are there, or that kind of stuff. Nothing really spectacular, I wouldn't imagine. The next one talks about conditional aggregates. You remember the sum if and the count if and all those kind of guys? And so I'm going to give you an example and say, tell me what the answer is going to be. Okay. The next one talks about the lookup table, but kind of a philosophical, kind of a high-level question. Not down in the weeds, but just talk to me, so to speak, and tell me what the heck these things are all about. What analogy, for example, would you use if you were trying to describe a lookup as an example? The next one really is a lookup example. So I'm gonna give you a lookup and say, is this gonna, what's it going to provide? What answer is going to appear in this particular cell? Okay, this is probably a good place to stop for the 15-minute mark. We'll polish this off in just a few.